The cigarette smoke hung thick in the back room of Sal's steakhouse, curling around the dim yellow bulbs like ghosts refusing to leave. It was a Tuesday night in late September, and Atlantic City was already starting to shed its summer skin. The boardwalk crowds had thinned out considerably, leaving behind the permanent residents, the ones who worked the tables, ran the numbers, and kept the city's darker machinery well-oiled and running smoothly through the changing seasons. Vito Mancini sat in the corner booth, his broad shoulders hunched forward, hands folded carefully on the red checkered tablecloth that had seen better days. He was 38 years old but looked a decade older. The kind of aging that comes from carrying weight that has nothing to do with muscle or physical labor. His black hair was slicked back with pomade, revealing a widow's peak that had crept further up his forehead in recent years, a genetic marker he shared with his late father. His face was angular and hard, carved from years of controlled violence and carefully managed emotions, with deep-set brown eyes that rarely met anyone else's directly. When they did, people looked away first. Always. He wore a charcoal suit with a thin black tie, perfectly pressed despite the oppressive humidity that clung to everything in this coastal city. The suit was expensive, not flashy, but quality. Vito believed in looking professional. In their line of work, appearance mattered. It communicated respect, discipline, control. Across from him sat Tommy 2 times Delgado, a nervous talker who had earned his nickname from the unfortunate habit of repeating himself when he got anxious, which was most of the time. Tommy was fidgeting with his lighter, a silver Zippo with the Marine Corps emblem engraved on the side, flicking it open and closed in a rhythm that was starting to grate on Vito's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. So like I said, Vito, Paulie wants the thing done by Thursday. Thursday at the latest. Tommy's voice cracked slightly on the second Thursday, betraying his nervousness. He was scared of Vito, even though they'd known each other since. They were kids running numbers for pennies in the old Italian neighborhood before urban. Renewal had bulldozed most of it into parking lots, Vito. Didn't respond immediately. He never did. Instead, he reached for his glass of scotch, Johnny Walker Black, neat, lifted it to his lips with a steady hand and took a slow, measured sip. The silence stretched out like a rubber band ready to snap, filling the space between them with tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. This was how Vito worked. He let the quiet do the talking. People filled silence with their own fears, their own doubts, their own guilty consciences. It made his job considerably easier. You hear me, Vito? Thursday. The guy's been skimming from the casino count. Paulie's pissed. Real pissed. Like throwing furniture pissed. Vito set the glass down carefully on a coaster, the ice cubes clinking against the crystal with a sound like wind chimes. He nodded once slowly. That was all Tommy needed. Good. Okay. I'll tell Paulie it's handled. You're the best, Vito. You really are. Most reliable guy in the organization. Tommy stood up too quickly, nearly knocking his chair over backward. He straightened his cheap polyester jacket, the kind you bought off the rack at Sears, threw 2 20s on the table even though Vito hadn't ordered any food, and hurried toward the door like a man eager to be anywhere else. When Tommy was gone, Vito sat alone in the booth for another 20 minutes, nursing his scotch and thinking. The restaurant was nearly empty now. Just an old couple in the front eating linguine with clam sauce and speaking in quiet Italian, and the bartender wiping down the mahogany counter with a dingy rag. Outside, through the grimy window that probably hadn't been properly cleaned in months, Vito could see the neon signs of the casinos flickering to life as dusk settled over the city like a blanket. Atlantic City had changed dramatically in the last few years. More tourists, more money flowing through legitimate and illegitimate channels, more heat from the federal agents who'd set up shop in the new field office on Baltic Avenue. But underneath all that glitter and noise and manufactured excitement, it was still the same. Still a city built on broken backs and broken promises, on dreams deferred and debts that could never be repaid. Vito thought about the man he'd have to visit on Thursday. Bobby Torino, a bookkeeper who'd gotten greedy, who'd thought he was smarter than the system, who'd believed he could skim a little here and there without anyone noticing. Vito had done this kind of work dozens of times over the past 2 decades. It was mechanical now, routine like changing a tire or fixing a leaky faucet. You showed up at the appointed time. You did what needed to be done with professional efficiency. You left without leaving evidence. No drama, no speeches, no emotional complications. Just cold, calculated efficiency. But lately something had been gnawing at him. A restlessness he couldn't quite name or articulate even to himself. Maybe it was age creeping up on him. Maybe it was simple exhaustion from 20 years of violence. Or maybe it was the fact that he'd been doing this dirty work since he was 18 years old and had absolutely nothing to show for it except a one-bedroom apartment in Ventnor with water-stained ceilings and a reputation for being reliable, for being the man you called when you needed. Something done quietly, permanently, and without complications. He finished his scotch in one long swallow and left $3 on the table for the waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who'd probably been working at Sal's since the Eisenhower administration. Outside, the September air was cooler than expected, almost crisp. A stiff breeze blew in from the ocean, carrying with it the distinctive smell of salt water and fried food from the boardwalk vendors, that uniquely Atlantic City combination of beach and grease. Vito walked down Pacific Avenue with his hands buried deep in his pockets, moving through the city like a shadow, like a ghost that nobody could quite focus on. People didn't notice him. That was entirely by design. In 20 years, he'd perfected the art of being invisible, of moving through spaces without leaving an impression. It was a survival skill in his line of work. His apartment was 6 blocks away from Sal's, located in a squat brick building sandwiched between a Chinese laundromat that never seemed to close and a pawn shop with bars on the windows. He climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, the steps creaking under his weight, unlocked the door with its 3 deadbolts and stepped inside. The place was sparse, a sagging couch he'd bought secondhand, a black and white television that only got 3 channels clearly, a small Formica kitchen table with 2 mismatched chairs. No photographs on the walls, no personal touches, no indication that anyone actually lived here beyond the most basic level. It was a place to sleep and nothing more. A way station between jobs. Vito poured himself another scotch from the bottle he kept on the kitchen counter and sat heavily on the couch, staring at the blank television screen. His reflection stared back at him from the dark glass, tired, hollow, empty. He thought about his brother, Frankie. Dead 3 months now. A car accident, they said. Catastrophic brake failure on the Garden State Parkway just north of the Seaview exit. Frankie's burgundy Cadillac had gone off the road at 70 miles an hour, smashing through a guardrail and into a concrete support pillar. Killed instantly, the police report said. Closed casket funeral because the damage had been so extensive. But Vito knew better. He'd worked in this business long enough, seen enough staged accidents to recognize a professional hit when he saw one. The brakes had been cut, expertly, carefully, in a way that would cause failure at high speed. Someone wanted Frankie dead, and they'd made it look like a tragic accident. Just another Italian kid from Atlantic City who drove too fast and paid the ultimate price. Frankie had been different from Vito in almost every way imaginable. Loud where Vito was quiet, flashy where Vito was subdued, always looking for an angle, always convinced he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He'd run a small crew doing hijackings and shakedowns, operating on the fringes of the Russo family's territory, always pushing boundaries, always testing limits. Vito had warned him repeatedly to be careful, and when Paulie found out, and Paulie always found out eventually, he'd ordered the hit. No trial, no conversation, no opportunity for Frankie to make restitution or beg forgiveness. Just a quick professional execution disguised as a tragic accident. Clean, efficient, permanent. The realization had hit Vito like a sledgehammer to the chest, knocking the wind out of him. Paulie, the man he'd trusted implicitly, the man he'd killed for without hesitation, the man he'd sworn loyalty to all those years ago, had murdered his brother, and Vito was expected to just keep working, keep following orders, keep being the quiet man who cleaned up messes without asking questions or expressing opinions. He drained the scotch and set the glass down hard on the scarred coffee table, hard enough that he heard the wood crack slightly. The anger was there now, simmering just beneath the surface of his carefully controlled exterior, cold and calculating and patient. Vito wasn't the type to lose his temper, to make rash decisions based on emotion, to act impulsively. 2 decades in this business had taught him the value of patience, of careful planning, of thinking 3 moves ahead. But he also wasn't the type to let something like this slide. Family was family. Blood was blood. Those weren't just empty words or sentimental platitudes. They were the foundation of everything, the bedrock principle that held their entire world together. If Polly had betrayed that principle, had violated that sacred bond, then the rules had changed. And if the rules had changed, then Vito was going to write his own. He stood up slowly, feeling every one of his 38 years in his joints and muscles, and walked to the bedroom. The room was as sparse as the rest of the apartment. A bed with rumpled sheets, a dresser with 3 drawers, a closet barely big enough to hold his suits. He opened the closet door and reached for the top shelf, pulling down an old beach towel that had once been blue but had faded to a dusty gray. Wrapped carefully inside was a .38 revolver, a Smith & Wesson Model 10, reliable and untraceable. He'd used it on 3 previous jobs, always careful to change out the barrel afterward. He took it down, checked the chamber with practiced efficiency, loaded 5 rounds, and set it carefully on the nightstand next to a clock radio that was perpetually 12 minutes fast. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, thinking, planning, calculating odds and outcomes. Thursday would come. He'd handle Bobby Torino like he'd been told, execute the job with his usual professional efficiency. But after that, things were going to be fundamentally different. After that, Vito Mancini was going to do something he'd never done before in his entire career. He was going to speak. He was going to make noise. He was going to make sure everyone heard him loud and clear, and Polly Russo was going to pay for what he'd done. By Wednesday afternoon, the weather had turned dramatically for the worse. Dark clouds rolled in from the Atlantic like an invading army, heavy and pregnant with rain that smelled of ozone and salt. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes, and the wind picked up considerably, rattling the windows of Vito's apartment and sending loose newspapers tumbling down the street like urban tumbleweeds. He stood at the window, one hand resting on the frame, watching the boardwalk below as tourists scurried for cover. Like ants fleeing a flood, and shopkeepers pulled their canvas awnings closed against the coming storm. Vito had spent the entire morning doing reconnaissance, driving the streets in his nondescript Dodge Coronet, observing patterns, taking mental notes. He'd driven past Bobby Torino's house in Margate 3 separate times at different hours, varying his route to avoid establishing a pattern that might be noticed. The house was a modest 2-story Cape Cod with weathered gray shingles, a white picket fence that needed painting, and a small fishing boat on a trailer in the driveway. Bobby was married with 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both in elementary school, a normal life, or at least the convincing appearance of one, the kind of life that looked good from the outside but was probably rotting from within, corrupted by greed and poor decisions. Vito knew the type well. Guys who thought they could play both sides of the fence, skim a little here and there, pocket some extra cash, and nobody would notice or care. Guys who convinced themselves they deserved more than they were getting, that the family owed them something, that their loyalty should be rewarded with money they hadn't earned. But somebody always noticed, somebody always cared, and there were always consequences. The hit was scheduled for Thursday night, less than 30 hours away now. Vito would intercept Bobby on his way home from Dante's Diner, a place on Ventnor Avenue where Bobby ate dinner every Thursday like clockwork. Some superstition about Thursday being his lucky day, apparently. It would be quick, clean, and done in a location where nobody would see or hear anything they might feel compelled to report. That was the job. That was what he'd been trained to do. But Vito's mind wasn't primarily focused on Bobby Torino. It was on Polly Russo. He'd been digging deeper over the past week, asking more questions, calling in favors from people who operated in different circles, people who saw things from different angles. And what he'd found made his blood run cold and his hands clench into fists. Polly hadn't just ordered the hit on Frankie. He'd been systematically skimming from the family for years. Small amounts at first, amounts so small they could easily be attributed to accounting errors or sloppy bookkeeping. But recently, in the past 6 months or so, Polly had gotten noticeably greedier and sloppier. He was siphoning off tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more, maybe significantly more. And he was using Vito and the other enforcers, Marco Esposito, Johnny Batts, Tommy Delgado, to clean up anyone who got too close to figuring it out, anyone who asked too many questions or looked too carefully at the numbers. It was a betrayal on multiple levels, each one deeper and more fundamental than the last. Polly had broken the code, the very foundation of their world, the bedrock principles that made their society function. You didn't steal from the family. You didn't lie to the people who trusted you. You didn't abuse the loyalty of men who'd killed for you. And you absolutely positively didn't kill a man's brother and expect him to keep working for you like nothing had happened. Like blood meant nothing. Vito felt the anger coiling tighter inside him, winding up like a spring under pressure. But anger without direction was useless, destructive, dangerous. Anger needed to be channeled, focused, weaponized. So he sat down at the small kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a ballpoint pen, and he started to think systematically, strategically, the way he'd been trained. Paulie was careful, paranoid even. He surrounded himself with loyalists, guys who'd known him for decades, guys whose entire livelihoods depended on Paulie's continued success and goodwill. His inner circle was small and tight: Tommy Delgado, Marco the Bull Esposito, Sal Giacomo, and a few others. They met at Paulie's social club on Tennessee Avenue every Friday night to count money, divvy up the week's take, discuss business, and plan operations. The club was heavily guarded, with lookouts positioned on every corner, armed men inside, multiple exit routes. Getting to Paulie there would be suicide, a one-way trip that would end with Vito dead in an alley. But Paulie had a weakness. Every man had a weakness, a crack in the armor, a moment of vulnerability, and Vito had identified Paulie's. Every Sunday morning, without fail, Paulie drove out to his beach house in Longport. He went alone, no bodyguards, no crew, no backup. It was his one moment of genuine solitude, his escape from the constant pressures of running the family, managing the operations, keeping everyone in line. Vito had been there once, several years ago, for a 4th of July barbecue back when things were simpler. He remembered the layout with crystal clarity: 2 stories, big windows facing the ocean, hardwood floors, expensive furniture. And out back, a private dock with a speedboat tied up, a sleek cigarette boat that Paulie loved and babied like it was his mistress. That was where Vito would make his move. That was where he would deliver his message. But first he needed to know more. He needed to understand exactly what Paulie was doing, where the money was going, and who else might be involved in the operation. If he was going to take down Paulie Russo, he had to make sure he understood the full scope of the corruption, had to ensure that the whole rotten structure came down with him. Otherwise, someone else, Marco maybe or Sal, would just step into Paulie's shoes and nothing would fundamentally change. The machine would keep running, grinding up lives and spitting out corpses. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple over the Atlantic, Vito drove across town to a bar called Lucky's, a dive on the edge of the inlet section, wedged between a defunct cannery and a marine supply store. It was the kind of place where off-duty cops and low-level criminals drank side by side at the scarred wooden bar, pretending not to recognize each other, maintaining the comfortable fiction that their worlds didn't intersect. Vito knew the bartender, a wiry guy named Eddie Malone who had a photographic memory and an almost supernatural talent for staying out of trouble, for knowing things without being implicated in anything. Eddie was wiping down the bar with a damp rag when Vito walked in, the door creaking on rusty hinges. The place was mostly empty, a couple of hardcore drunks at the end of the bar nursing beers and staring at nothing, a poker game in the back room where men spoke in low voices and cigarette smoke hung in thick layers. Eddie looked up and gave Vito a barely perceptible nod of recognition. Vito. Long time. Too long. Yeah. Vito sat down on a cracked vinyl bar stool and ordered a beer. When Eddie brought it over, a Schlitz in a bottle, ice cold, Vito leaned in close, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I need information, Eddie. Eddie glanced around nervously, checking sightlines, making sure nobody was paying attention. What kind of information? The kind that gets people killed if they talk about it too freely. The kind that requires discretion and compensation. Eddie's expression didn't change substantially, but Vito saw the flicker of fear in his pale blue eyes, the slight tensing of his jaw muscles. I don't know if I can help you, Vito. Some things are better left alone. You can. Vito reached into his jacket slowly, telegraphing the movement, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He set it on the bar between them, keeping his hand on top of it. 500. Just for listening. Just for sharing what you know. Eddie hesitated for a long moment, doing the mental calculation, weighing the risks against the rewards. Then he picked up the envelope and tucked it quickly into his stained apron. "What do you want to know?" "Paulie Russo, who's he working with? Who knows about the skimming? Who's protecting him?" Eddie's face went visibly pale, the color draining from his cheeks. "Jesus Christ, Vito. You're asking me to sign my own death warrant. You're asking me to commit suicide. Nobody has to know we talked. Nobody will know. I'm good at keeping secrets, Eddie. You know that." Eddie exhaled slowly, a long, shaky breath, then leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to barely audible. "There's a guy, federal agent, name's Crowley. Patrick Crowley. He's been sniffing around the casinos for months now, asking questions about the family's operations, about money flows, about protection rackets. Word is he's building a case, a big case. RICO charges, the whole 9 yards. And word is Paulie knows about it." Vito's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together. "Paulie's talking to the feds? Paulie's cooperating?" "I don't know for sure. Nobody knows for sure. But there's been rumors, strong rumors from reliable sources. Paulie's been seen meeting with someone who fits Crowley's description. Late at night, out by the marina, down by the loading docks where nobody goes. Could be nothing. Could be coincidence. But in this business, coincidences are usually something else." Vito processed this information carefully, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. If Paulie was cooperating with federal agents, that fundamentally changed everything. It meant Paulie was trying to save himself, probably cutting some kind of immunity deal to avoid prison time for racketeering or tax evasion. And if that was the case, then everyone in the family was potentially at risk, including Vito. Everyone except whoever Paulie was protecting in exchange for his cooperation. Who else knows about this? Who else has seen these meetings? Just me. And now you. Eddie looked genuinely terrified now, his hands shaking slightly. "Don't come back here, Vito. I can't help you anymore. I've already said too much. If anyone finds out, they won't." Vito finished his beer in one long pull and stood up. He dropped another $50 bill on the bar. "You never saw me tonight, Eddie." "Never saw who?" Eddie was already wiping down the spot where Vito had been sitting, erasing evidence. Vito walked out into the rain that had finally started falling in earnest. Cold drops that stung his face and soaked through his jacket almost immediately. His mind was churning, processing, calculating. Paulie wasn't just a thief and a traitor, he was a rat. An informant. The worst thing you could be in their world. And if the feds were involved, if Crowley was building a case, then the clock was ticking loudly. Vito had to move fast, had to act decisively before the whole thing collapsed around him. He drove back to his apartment through streets slick with rain, parked the Dodge in its usual spot, and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, listening to the rain hammer against the windshield and roof, watching water stream down the glass in rivulets. He thought about Frankie, about all the years he'd spent being unquestioningly loyal to Paulie, about the men he'd hurt and killed on Paulie's orders without ever asking why or questioning the necessity. And he thought about what came next, about the point of no return he was rapidly approaching. There was no going back now. Vito had crossed a line just by asking questions, just by investigating, just by knowing what he now knew. If Paulie found out, and in this world people always found out eventually, Vito would be dead by the weekend, his body dumped in the Pine Barrens or buried in concrete somewhere. So the only viable option was to move forward aggressively, to finish what he'd started, to see it through to whatever end awaited him. On Thursday night, Vito would handle Bobby Torino as ordered. He'd maintain his cover, keep up appearances, continue being the reliable enforcer everyone expected him to be. And on Sunday, he'd handle Paulie Russo. He'd deliver his message. He'd extract his payment for Frankie's death. After that, whatever happened would happen. Vito had made his peace with that reality. Thursday night arrived with a vengeance that felt almost biblical. The rain had finally stopped around noon, but the wind was absolutely relentless, whipping through the streets and alleys with enough force to send trash cans tumbling down sidewalks and tear shingles off roofs. The sky was a bruised purple color, heavy clouds racing across the face of a pale moon like they were running from something terrifying and inevitable. Vito parked his Dodge Coronet 2 blocks away from Dante's Diner, the place where Bobby Torino ate dinner every Thursday night like it was some kind of religious ritual. He'd been watching Bobby for 3 full days now, learning his routines and habits, documenting his patterns with the thoroughness of a scientist conducting research. Bobby was textbook creature of habit. Same diner, same booth by the window, same meal. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes and brown gravy, green beans on the side, cherry pie with vanilla ice cream for dessert, coffee with 2 sugars. He always left around 8:30, walked to his car alone, and drove the same route home through the quieter streets. Tonight would be no different from any other Thursday. Except tonight, Bobby Torino wouldn't make it home to his wife and kids. Tonight, Bobby would pay the price for his greed and stupidity. Vito checked his watch, a simple Timex with a leather band. Nothing flashy. 8:20. He got out of the car slowly, checked his surroundings with the practiced eye of someone who'd survived 2 decades in a dangerous business, and walked casually down the street with his hands buried in his pockets and his head angled down slightly. He looked like any other guy out for an evening walk, maybe heading to a bar or visiting a friend. Invisible. Unremarkable. Exactly as intended. He positioned himself near the narrow alley that ran alongside the diner, just out of the circle of light cast by the street lamps, pressing his back against the brick wall and becoming part of the shadows. From this vantage point, he had a clear, unobstructed view of the parking lot. Bobby's car, a brown Buick LeSabre with a dent in the rear bumper, was parked under a flickering streetlight that buzzed and sputtered like it was dying. At 8:32, right on schedule, Bobby emerged from the diner, patting his rounded stomach contentedly and laughing at something the waitress had said, probably the same joke she told all the regulars. He was a stocky man in his mid-40s, balding rapidly with just a horseshoe of dark hair around his skull, with a round face and a thick, drooping mustache that made him look like a walrus. He looked like somebody's favorite uncle, the kind who brought gifts at Christmas and told inappropriate jokes at family gatherings. Harmless. Jovial. But Vito knew better than to judge by appearances. Bobby had stolen from the family. Bobby had broken faith. And in this world, in their world, that was an unforgivable sin that carried only one possible sentence. Bobby walked to his car with that peculiar waddle heavy men develop, fumbling with his keys and humming something under his breath, some song from the radio probably. Vito moved quickly and silently, years of practice allowing him to close the distance in seconds without making a sound. He came up behind Bobby just as the man managed to get his key into the lock. Bobby. Bobby spun around with surprising speed for a man his size, eyes wide with surprise and instant fear. Jesus Christ. Vito, you scared the absolute hell out of me. What are you doing here? Vito didn't say anything immediately. He just stood there, looking at Bobby with those deep-set brown eyes that had watched men die, his expression completely unreadable, his face a blank mask. Bobby's smile faltered and died like a candle in a strong wind. What's going on? Did Polly send you? Is there a problem? Get in the car, Bobby. What? Why? Come on, Vito, we can just talk right here. Whatever this is about, go get in the car. The fear was creeping into Bobby's voice now, making it go up half an octave. Come on, Vito, we've known each other for years. We can talk about this like reasonable men. Whatever Polly told you. Vito pulled the .38 revolver from inside his jacket in one smooth, practiced motion and pressed it firmly against Bobby's ribs just below the heart. Get in the car. Now. Don't make me say it again. Bobby's face went absolutely white, all the blood draining out of it like someone had pulled a plug. He nodded quickly, jerkily like a puppet on strings, and climbed into the driver's seat with trembling hands. Vito walked around to the passenger side with the gun held low against his leg, got in beside Bobby and kept the weapon trained steadily on him. Drive. Where? Bobby's voice was barely above a whisper now. Down to the marina, the old section near the abandoned cannery. They drove in heavy silence through the darkened streets of Atlantic City, passing closed shops and flickering neon signs and the occasional drunk stumbling home from a bar. Bobby's breathing was quick and shallow, almost hyperventilating, his knuckles bone-white on the steering wheel. Vito sat perfectly still beside him, the gun resting steadily on his lap, his face showing nothing. When they reached the marina, Vito directed Bobby to a secluded spot near the docks, far away from the main area where the pleasure boats were kept. This was where the commercial fishing boats had once operated before the industry collapsed, leaving behind only rotting piers and rusting equipment. There were no lights here, no people, no witnesses, just the sound of water slapping rhythmically against weathered wooden pilings and the distant hum of the city that never quite slept. "Turn off the engine." Bobby complied immediately, his hand still shaking.
"Vito, please."
"I got a wife, kids. Susan's only 8 years old. Michael just turned 6. I made a mistake, okay? I'll admit it. I made a terrible mistake, but I can pay it back. Every cent, I swear on my mother's grave." Vito looked at him steadily. "How much did you take?" 30 grand. Maybe a little more, 35 at most, but I can get it back, I swear. I've got some money saved. I can borrow from my brother-in-law. 2 weeks tops, I'll have every penny. Polly doesn't care about the money, Bobby." Bobby's voice cracked like thin ice. "Then what does he care about?" "Control. Respect. Making sure everyone knows what happens when you steal from him." Vito chambered around in the 38 with a distinct metallic click that sounded impossibly loud in the confined space. He can't let people think they can steal from him and get away with it. It would make him look weak, and looking weak is the same as being dead in this business. Tears were streaming down Bobby's face now, cutting tracks through the sweat. "Please, Vito, don't do this. I'm begging you. I'm literally begging for my life. Those kids need their father. Susan's got a dance recital next month. Michael's in Little League, please." Vito felt something twist painfully inside his chest, some emotion he'd thought he'd successfully killed years ago. He'd done this before, dozens of times, maybe hundreds if he counted them all up. But tonight, looking at Bobby's terrified, tear-stained face, hearing him beg for his children, Vito felt the weight of it differently. This wasn't some hardened criminal who'd chosen the life and accepted the consequences. Bobby wasn't a killer or a tough guy. He was just a weak man who'd gotten greedy, who'd made a catastrophically bad choice. And now he was going to die for it, leaving those kids without a father. But that wasn't what bothered Vito most. What bothered him was that he was the instrument of execution, the weapon Polly wielded, the silent killer who cleaned up messes without asking uncomfortable questions or expressing moral opinions. And Polly had used that same instrument to kill Frankie. Had used Vito's loyalty and obedience to murder his own brother. Vito lowered the gun slowly. "Get out of the car." Bobby blinked, completely confused. "What? Get out. And start running, fast as you can. Don't stop. Don't look back. Don't go home. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Understand?" Bobby stared at him in utter disbelief. "Is this a trick? Are you going to shoot me in the back?" "No trick. You've got 10 seconds to disappear before I change my mind. Starting now." Bobby didn't need to be told twice. He threw open the door and bolted into the darkness, running like a man escaping from hell itself, stumbling over broken concrete and rusted chains. Vito watched him go, watched his shape disappear into the shadows between buildings, then raised the 38 and fired 2 shots into the night air. The sound echoed across the water, sharp and final and unmistakable. The sound of a job completed, a life ended, a problem solved. Except the problem wasn't solved. Not really. Vito had just created an entirely new set of problems. Had just painted a target on his own back that he'd never be able to remove. He sat in the car for a long time after Bobby had disappeared, the gun heavy and warm in his hand, the smell of cordite hanging in the air. He'd just let a mark go. He'd disobeyed a direct order from Polly Russo. And when Polly found out, and he absolutely would find out probably within 24 hours, Vito would be a dead man. There would be no explanations accepted, no excuses entertained, no mercy shown. But Vito found that he didn't care anymore. Something fundamental had broken inside him. Some essential piece of the machinery that had kept him functioning as Polly's weapon for 20 years. He was done being silent, done being obedient, done being the quiet man who killed without question. He started the Buick. Bobby had left the keys in the ignition in his panic and drove it to a different section of the marina, wiping down the steering wheel and door handles carefully before abandoning it. Then he walked the 1.5 miles back to where he'd parked his own car, hands in his pockets, collar turned up against the cold wind. When he got back to his apartment, the anger had crystallized into something harder, colder, more purposeful. He poured himself a drink, scotch, 3 fingers, no ice, and sat down at the kitchen table. He pulled out the yellow legal pad again and started writing in careful block letters. Names, dates, locations, bank account numbers he'd memorized. Everything he knew about Polly's operation, about the skimming, about the meetings with Agent Crowley, about the money laundering through the casinos. When he was finished, he had 5 pages of detailed information, enough to bring down not just Paulie but half the organization. Enough to put people in prison for decades. He folded the pages carefully and slipped them into a manila envelope, sealed it, and wrote an address on the front. Tomorrow morning he'd mail it to someone who could use it. Someone who'd make sure Paulie Russo got exactly what was coming to him. But first, there was one more thing Vito had to do. One final piece of business to settle before the whole thing came crashing down. On Sunday, Paulie Russo was going to take a boat ride. And Vito was going to be the one steering the boat, choosing the destination, determining the outcome. He finished his drink and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. He lay there in the darkness, staring at the water-stained ceiling, thinking about Frankie. Thinking about all the lives he'd taken on Paulie's orders. Thinking about Bobby Torino running through the darkness. Probably still running. Probably would never stop running. And thinking about the deep, cold Atlantic Ocean, and how it kept all its secrets buried in the darkness at the bottom where no light ever reached. Sunday arrived cold and unforgiving. The kind of October morning that warned of the harsh winter to come. The Atlantic was restless and angry, churning under a sky the color of old concrete, waves capped with dirty white foam that looked almost violent. Vito stood on the dock behind Paulie's beach house in Longport, watching the water, feeling the spray on his face. The wind cut through his jacket like it wasn't even there, but he didn't move. He'd been standing there for 20 minutes waiting, preparing himself mentally for what came next. The beach house was an impressive structure, 2 stories of weathered cedar shingles and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the gray sky. Worth at least $300,000, probably more. Paulie had bought it 10 years ago as a retreat, a place to escape the pressures of the business. Vito wondered how much of the money that had purchased this palace had been skimmed from the family, stolen from the people who'd trusted Paulie. It was just after noon when Paulie's black Lincoln Continental pulled into the circular driveway, tires crunching on the crushed shell path. Vito heard the car door slam with authority, heard Paulie's heavy footsteps on the wooden deck that wrapped around the house. He turned slowly, deliberately, making no sudden movements. Paulie Russo was an imposing figure even in his early 60s, 6'2" and solidly built, with a thick neck and massive hands that looked capable of breaking bones without effort. His gray hair was swept back in that old-school style, held in place with pomade, and he wore an expensive leather jacket over a black turtleneck, the uniform of a man who'd made it, who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. When he saw Vito standing on his dock, his expression shifted rapidly from surprise to suspicion to something darker. "Vito, the hell are you doing here? This is private property." Vito didn't answer immediately. He just stood there with his hands at his sides, his face that same unreadable mask he'd worn for 20 years. But something was different now. His eyes weren't empty anymore. They were full of something burning and dangerous. Paulie walked closer, his posture aggressive, territorial. "I didn't call you. Nobody authorized you to be here. Who told you to come to my house?" "Nobody." The word came out flat, emotional. Paulie stopped about 10 feet away, his instincts warning him that something was wrong, that this situation wasn't what it appeared to be. "Then what the hell is this about? You got something to say to me?" Vito reached slowly into his jacket, telegraphing the movement so Paulie wouldn't panic, and pulled out a photograph. It was bent at the corners, faded slightly with age. He held it up so Paulie could see clearly. It was a picture of Frankie Mancini, taken at a family barbecue 5 years ago. Frankie was smiling his characteristic cocky smile, holding a beer, his arm draped around Vito's shoulders. Brothers, family, blood. Paulie's face hardened immediately, his jaw muscles clenching visibly. "Put that goddamn thing away. Right now. You killed him." Vito's voice was quiet but carried clearly over the sound of the waves. "You killed my brother." "What the hell are you talking about?" "Don't." Vito's voice gained an edge, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Don't insult me by pretending you didn't. Don't stand there and lie to my face after everything. I know about the breaks. I know it was a hit. And I know you ordered it." Paulie's expression changed, the mask slipping slightly. "Frankie was skimming, Vito. He was stealing from the family. From me. What the hell did you expect me to do? Pat him on the head and tell him to be more careful next time? You could have talked to me. You could have given him a chance to make restitution. You could have. There are no chances in this business, Vito. You know that better than anyone. You've been doing this work for 20 years. Frankie knew the rules. He broke them. He paid the price. That's how this works. He was my brother, and he was my problem. Polly's voice was cold now, completely without sympathy or remorse. You think you're the only one who's lost family in this business? You think you're special? This life takes everything from everyone eventually. That's the price we pay for the money and the power and the respect. Vito felt the anger rising like bile in his throat, threatening to choke him. And you made yours. What? Your choice. You chose to betray the family, chose to skim for years, chose to meet with federal agents and cut deals to save your own skin. Vito's voice was getting louder now, something breaking through the carefully maintained control. You broke every rule, violated every principle, and then you used me, used all of us to clean up your messes. To kill anyone who got close to figuring out what you were doing. Polly's hand moved reflexively toward his waistband. Reaching for the gun Vito knew he always carried. But Vito was faster. Decades of muscle memory and practiced efficiency. He pulled the .38 and aimed it directly at Polly's chest before Polly's fingers even touched his weapon. Don't. Polly froze, his hand hovering near his gun, his eyes locked on Vito's. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Vito. You understand that? You pull that trigger and you're a dead man. The family will hunt you down. Marco, Johnny, Tommy. They'll tear this state apart looking for you. You'll be dead within a week, maybe less. Maybe. Vito gestured with the gun toward the sleek cigarette boat tied to the dock, its white hull gleaming even under the gray sky. But first, you're gonna take a ride with me. Get in the boat. Polly didn't move. His eyes were calculating, looking for an opening, an opportunity, a way to turn this situation to his advantage. What's this about, Vito? You want revenge? You want to feel like a big man? You want to prove something? His voice shifted, became almost conversational, the tone of a man trying to talk his way out of trouble. Pull the trigger then, do it. But it won't bring Frankie back. It won't change anything. You'll still be the same guy you were yesterday, just with one more body on your conscience. Get in the boat, Polly. I'm not going to ask again. They stood there for a long moment, locked in a silent battle of wills, the wind howling around them and waves crashing against the pilings. Then Polly's shoulders sagged slightly in resignation or acceptance, and he walked slowly to the dock. He climbed carefully into the boat, moving like a man twice his age, and sat heavily in the passenger seat. Vito followed, keeping the gun trained steadily on Polly the entire time. He untied the mooring line with one hand, started the powerful engine with a roar that drowned out the wind, and pushed the throttle forward aggressively. The boat leaped away from the dock like a racehorse out of the gate, slamming against the waves as Vito pushed it faster and faster, heading straight out into the open ocean. The ride was brutal and punishing. The boat hammered against wave after wave, sometimes catching air and crashing down hard enough to rattle their teeth. Spray drenched them both, cold and stinging. Polly sat rigidly in the passenger seat, his face pale but his expression defiant. He wasn't going to beg. Vito knew that. Polly was too proud, too stubborn, too convinced of his own importance. After 25 minutes of hard running, Vito finally cut the engine. They were far from shore now. The city was just a faint smudge on the horizon, barely visible through the haze. They were surrounded by nothing but gray water and gray sky, alone in the vastness of the Atlantic. The only sounds were the wind, the waves, and the creaking of the boat as it rocked in the swells. Polly looked around, taking in their isolation, then looked back at Vito. So this is it? This is how it ends? You bring me out here and put a bullet in me? Feed me to the sharks like some cheap movie? Vito reached into his jacket and pulled out the manila envelope, the one containing all the information about Polly's operation. He tossed it onto Polly's lap. That's everything. Names, dates, bank accounts, meeting locations, everything you've been doing. The skimming, the meetings with Agent Crowley, all of it. Polly's eyes widened fractionally, genuine surprise breaking through his controlled exterior. You've been investigating me? You've been digging into my business? I had to know the truth. Had to understand why you'd betray the family. Why you'd kill Frankie. Vito's voice was steady now, almost calm. You're not just a thief, Polly. You're a rat. You're working with the feds, cutting deals, trying to save yourself while everyone else goes down. That's not— I don't lie. The words exploded out of Vito. all the rage and pain and betrayal finally breaking through. I've got witnesses. I've got documentation. You've been meeting with Crowley for months, feeding him information, probably trying to arrange immunity for yourself. You're gonna let the whole family burn so you can walk away clean. Polly's face twisted with something. Anger, guilt, maybe both. You self-righteous son of a bitch. You think you're better than me? You think you're some kind of saint? How many people have you killed for me, Vito? 20? 30 more? How many lives have you destroyed? How many wives have you made into widows? How many kids have you left without fathers? His voice rose, became almost hysterical. You're just as dirty as I am. You're just as guilty. You're just as damned. The only difference is I'm smart enough to try to survive. I know what I am. Vito's hand tightened on the gun, his finger moving to the trigger. That's why I can do this. He fired once. The bullet caught Polly high in the chest, just below the collarbone. Polly gasped, his eyes going wide with shock and pain, his hand clutching at the wound as blood began to seep between his fingers, dark and thick and undeniable. Vito. Polly's voice was weak now, fading. Vito fired again. This time the bullet hit Polly square in the chest, right over the heart. Polly's body jerked backward from the impact, and he slumped in the seat, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. That's for Frankie, Vito said quietly. He fired a third time. Polly's body went limp, all the fight and arrogance and pride draining out of him along with his blood. His eyes stared at nothing, already glassing over with the unmistakable look of death. For a long time, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, Vito couldn't tell. He just sat there, staring at Polly's body, the gun still in his hand. The boat rocked gently on the waves and seabirds circled overhead, their cries sounding almost mournful. He felt empty, hollow, like he'd burned out the last piece of himself that was capable of feeling anything at all. Finally, mechanically, Vito stood up. He grabbed Polly's body under the arms and dragged it to the edge of the boat. It was heavier than he expected, dead weight, literally. With a grunt of effort, he rolled Polly over the side. The body hit the water with a heavy splash and sank immediately, disappearing into the dark depths. Polly Russo, who'd ruled Atlantic City's underworld for 20 years, who'd commanded armies of men, who'd made and destroyed fortunes, was gone. Just like that, erased. Food for the fish and the sharks and the things that lived in the darkness at the bottom of the ocean. Vito watched the spot where Polly had disappeared, watched the ripples spread and fade. He thought about everything that had led to this moment, the years of loyalty, the violence, the silence, the brotherhood that had been built on blood and broken promises, and he drove to a payphone outside a convenience store on Atlantic Avenue. His hands were surprisingly steady as he dropped coins into the slot and dialed the number he'd memorized. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Atlantic City Field Office. I need to speak with Agent Patrick Crowley. Who's calling? My name is Vito Mancini. I have information about the Russo crime family. Everything he needs to bring down the entire organization. Names, bank accounts, locations, operations, everything. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. Hold, please. Vito waited, watching cars pass on the street. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware of the violence that had just occurred a few miles offshore. This is Crowley. The voice was sharp, intelligent, cautious. You said your name is Mancini? That's right. I mailed you an envelope yesterday. Should arrive tomorrow or the next day. Everything's in there. But I'm calling to tell you that Polly Russo won't be a problem anymore. You can cross him off your list. What do you mean? Where is he? He's gone. That's all you need to know. The family's going to be in chaos for a while. If you move fast, you can roll up half the organization before they figure out what's happening. Mr. Mancini, I need you to come in. We need to talk about... Vito hung up before Crowley could finish. He walked back to his car, got in, and just sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Then he started the engine and drove north on the Garden State Parkway. He didn't know exactly where he was going. Maybe New York, maybe Boston, maybe all the way to Canada. It didn't really matter. What mattered was that he was finally free, free from Polly. Free from the family, free from the silence that had defined and constrained his entire adult life. But freedom, Vito was discovering, came with a price that never stopped being paid. And as the miles disappeared behind him and Atlantic City faded into memory in his rearview mirror, he knew that Price would follow him like a shadow for the rest of his days. The ocean had swallowed Paulie Russo, had taken his body down into the cold darkness where nothing would ever find it. But it would never swallow the weight of what Vito had done. Some burdens you carried forever whether you wanted to or not. Vito drove north through the afternoon, through the evening, through the night. And somewhere